Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, President Joe Biden changes the course of the U.S. election.
The U.S. President Joe Biden has ended his re-election campaign.
It's almost unprecedented in American politics, putting the Democrats into uncharted territory. How did Biden come to this moment, and what will it mean for November? I'm Malika Bilal, and this is The Take. Something seismic has happened in the world of U.S. politics.
President Joe Biden has said that he will step aside as a candidate and he will focus on fulfilling his duties as president for the remainder of his term.
President Biden now formally endorsing Kamala Harris.
Joe Biden will not be the nominee for the Democrats in November's presidential election. So to understand this moment, I talked to a journalist who's covered Biden up close for years.
My name is Sabrina Siddiqui. I'm a national politics reporter at the Wall Street Journal, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. I covered President Biden when he was vice president to President Obama. Then I covered his 2020 presidential campaign, and I've covered his presidency since he was inaugurated in 2021 and was covering his re-election campaign.
So you've been covering not only Biden, but the White House and Washington for years as well. And it's definitely felt like the forces around Joe Biden have been gathering in recent weeks. What have you heard happening behind the scenes? What has it been like?
I think that what we've seen is a steady drumbeat of Democrats calling on President Biden to step aside, both publicly and privately, ever since his disastrous debate performance against former President Trump in late June.
I'm going to continue to move until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers.
President Trump?
I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either.
The debate was really just 10 minutes in when President Biden began to stumble very noticeably. He was losing his train of thought. He was mumbling. He was hard to hear. And he was often confusing facts and figures and numbers.
We have 1,000 billionaires in America. And what's happening? They're in a situation where they, in fact, pay 8.2% in taxes. If they just paid 24%, 25%, either one of those numbers, they'd raise $500 billion, I should say, in a 10-year period.
And just when the debate was only just getting underway, you already had Democrats on Capitol Hill, Democratic lawmakers, activists, party officials panicking, texting reporters saying, this is a disaster. We're not going to be able to recover from this. And this is, mind you, a 90-minute debate. So it just showed you that right off the bat, people knew that this was going to be a turning point potentially in the campaign. It was the first time that Democrats as a party, they were truly entertaining the idea that President Biden is perhaps not best suited to be at the top of the ticket. And then I think because President Biden and his efforts to clean up his debate performance to really demonstrate that, no, he is in fact capable of being the party's nominee, didn't actually do anything to really alleviate people's concerns. The interviews he gave were not very convincing. He essentially had to be speaking from a teleprompter in order to really stay on script. He was still confusing names in high-profile moments. It just didn't do enough, I think, to convince members of his party that he is the one who can defeat Donald Trump in November. And that's really how we got here.
Wow. Okay, so you mentioned that moment, the debate, which we all saw between Biden and Donald Trump, was the turning point. But behind the scenes, these conversations likely had been happening. Were you privy to any of those? What would those conversations even look like?
I think what's been so staggering about this is this has been an entirely avoidable situation. If you even take it a step back, prior to not just the debate, but prior to the entire re-election campaign, you had poll after poll after poll before President Biden formally declared he was going to seek a second term, showing that a majority of Democrats wanted someone else at the top of the ticket, not because they weren't satisfied with the job that President Biden had done, but because he had actually positioned himself in 2020 when he ran as more of a transitional figure, as, a bridge for the next generation of leadership. And so, I think that what happened when President Biden decided that, no, he is going to run for re-election, Democrats just rallied behind him, right? They rallied behind him. And so when you talk about the conversations that were happening behind the scenes, I think what really happened is that because President Biden has always been protected by this very, very small inner circle, there wasn't really a sense, not just when it comes to the public, but even just within the party, of just how much he had aged. I mean, people see it, but it's different when you're constantly seeing him delivering a speech that's essentially from a teleprompter. They hadn't seen him in a high-profile, unscripted moment until the debate. And I think it was shocking for a lot of Democratic lawmakers even, who may have attended some meetings with him and then seen some of the change, but I don't think they realized how bad it would be. This group of senior aides who've been by his side, some of them for decades, really limited access to him in a way that I think it shielded just how much he really has aged.
Yeah, New York Magazine, in a piece not too long ago, called that bubble around him, if you will, a conspiracy of silence around Biden, saying that this has been a conversation in Washington for a while. You have been in some pretty tough spots with President Biden over the years, including being just one of 2 journalists to travel with him to Ukraine last year. This was him speaking on that trip.
1 year later, Kyiv stands. And Ukraine stands. Democracy stands. The Americas stands with you, and the world stands with you. Kyiv has captured a part of my heart, I must say.
Let's talk about then and since. I want to hear what you've seen from him. I know it's in glimpses, and it is in prepared remarks, and it's there's a formality to it all. But what's your takeaway of all of these years of your coverage of Biden?
I think that there's no question that you can see a notable difference in his energy, in his vigor. And again, when he's not speaking from the prompter, he is one of these people who in one moment can be walking through the most extensive details of some obscure policy. But then, if it's the next day and he's having an off day, then he's not necessarily remembering the name of one of his own cabinet secretaries. And so that, I think, lack of consistency has been very noticeable. There have been these moments like when he traveled to Ukraine, which was a very treacherous journey for a sitting president to take, going to an active war zone where there's no U.S. presence on the ground. He was very defiant. It was this really big moment in his presidency. It was one of the highlights without question. And, I think because he's been seen as delivering, the party really hadn't reckoned with the fact that this is not the same Joe Biden that we saw even 4 years ago. But I also don't think that anyone foresaw that it would come to the point where his own party is calling on him to step aside, again, just over 3 months before the election, and that it would ultimately be his undoing.
What this all means for Vice President Kamala Harris after the break. So, Sabrina, let's talk about who got us here and how much age is a factor in Washington in general. And I want to start with the caveat that some of the coverage of this really has smacked of ageism and makes me afraid to age, and probably makes a lot of people afraid to age and wonder what's allowed in our society that valorizes youth. That said, we are all not running for public office or the highest office in the land. One of the main players in all of this drama was reportedly former U.S. Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, who is 84 years old. What has she been doing the last few weeks, and what is the role of these senior Democrats generally, some of whom are advanced in age?
There is a great irony here, right? There are a number of Democratic lawmakers, past and present, who are either just as old as President Biden or just a couple years younger or just a few years older, who are the ones who led the chorus calling for him to step aside. And I think that there's a couple of things here. One is that I don't think that people are saying that age is uniquely disqualifying. The issue here is that everyone ages differently. And so one of the things that I think has been very frustrating for members of the public is that former President Trump is only 3 years younger than President Biden. And former President Trump is incredibly incoherent. He's always rambling. He also mixes up names all the time.
Trump facing criticism and questions regarding his mental fitness after comments at a rally this weekend where he mixed up his Republican rival Nikki Haley and the former Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, when discussing January 6th.
But I think he's always played by a different set of rules, and that frustrates people because, one, it speaks to the idea that the media, when covering these two candidates, they hold both of them to different standards. With Trump, because he's kind of always been a carnival barker, people, I think, are having more trouble separating what's just Trump being flamboyant and being all over the place compared with what's signs that Trump also has aged, which he has. He was falling asleep in the courtroom during these criminal trials that he's been under. If President Biden fell asleep somewhere, the response would obviously be 24/7 coverage just of the fact that he fell asleep. I think voters, it's really interesting when you ask them about President Biden, age was one of the big issues that came up. And with former President Trump, it was not age, even though they knew that he's almost just as old. It was always that same thing about chaos, instability, threat to democracy, the rhetoric, it's too much, they're not comfortable with him, personality, they don't like him as a person. So, they're just judged on an entirely different curve. It just manifests differently. So I think that there's still a conversation about, lawmakers, and people have talked about term limits. People have talked about, should people still be able to serve in the Senate into their 80s, into their 90s. But, again, I think when it comes to President Biden, we're talking about the most powerful position in the country, arguably one of the most influential, if not the most influential leader in the world. And so it just comes back to this idea that in this case, the stakes are too high.
Yeah. Even though it hasn't been a factor in the headlines, it is impossible to ignore how Biden's support for Israel has played into his support among groups that Democrats need to win the election in November. So I'm wondering from you how much of a factor you think Gaza was for Democratic leaders, let's say before the debate, and how much has the discussion changed since the debate? Does it even come up?
This has been very fascinating because prior to the debate, while age has always been a big vulnerability, as we've come back to throughout this conversation for President Biden, the biggest obstacle he was facing prior to the debate when it came to his prospects for re-election was probably his handling of Gaza and the level of anger that has been coming from, as you note, key constituencies that comprise the Democratic base. I think that it's hard to really overstate how much of a threat that has posed in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, key battlegrounds, Georgia, that were instrumental to Biden's path to the presidency in 2020. I do think, though, that Democrats themselves, in terms of the so-called establishment or the rank-and-file Democrats in Washington, I think they were living in a bubble. I think despite all the backlash and despite all the protests, their thinking was still, when the choice comes down to Biden and Trump, people will put those reservations aside and enough of them will still cast a ballot for Biden. We have time to negotiate and hopefully secure some kind of ceasefire deal. We have time to try and convey that Trump would be so much worse even on this issue. And it took them some time to realize that, no, it's not just an issue for Muslim voters or Arab American voters who have voted majority Democrat for decades now. It's young voters of all races and ethnicities and backgrounds. There's a huge generational shift when you look at attitudes and views on this issue. It's Black voters who were obviously the reason why President Biden is in the White House in the first place. Women, there's a lot of groups that were just fundamentally troubled and shocked that the Biden administration wasn't doing more, not just doing more to rein in Israel, but that they were continuing to provide weapons and military equipment to Israel that is directly being used in these mass civilian casualty events. I don't think the issue goes away, even if it's not President Biden at the top of the ticket.
Right. Exactly. Which brings me to my next question. What has Vice President Kamala Harris been doing throughout all of this? How has she been playing her cards?
You know, Vice President Harris is really interesting here because she has been one of President Biden's most loyal and fierce defenders, both in public and private, since the debate. And I think what was interesting is she was put in the position where she was already set to be on CNN, which hosted the debate right after. And that's not what she was expecting to respond to. And she had this line that then became one of the go-to lines for, Democrats who were defending Biden and for President Biden himself.
I'm not going to spend all night with you talking about the last 90 minutes when I've been watching the last 3.5 years of performance.
And I think that actually showed how savvy she is in the moment, but also just spoke to the position she's in, where she's the vice president. She serves the president and his agenda. So, her approach in public and private has been to say, look, I see Joe Biden all the time. I know he's capable. And, we all have off nights. And the bigger threat here is Trump and the threat to democracy. And we need to stop all this infighting and do away with the drama and just refocus on the task ahead, which is to defeat Trump in November. That doesn't mean that, she hadn't been hearing from donors who were anxious or, activists and other leaders within the party. With Vice President Harris, I also think that when the question came up about who could take Biden's place, there was just a point, probably a week or so after the debate, where you started hearing from a growing number of Democrats, both publicly and privately, who said, if it's going to be anyone, it has to be Vice President Harris. She was the first woman to serve as vice president. She's the first Black person to serve as vice president. She is the first person of Indian descent to serve as vice president. So there was also this chorus of Democrats, influential Democrats, saying, can you imagine what it's going to look like if we pass over Vice President Harris and go with someone else?
Final question. As this election year got started and you're plotting out your assignments with your editors, did you see it ending up like this?
No, I think that when this election began, people always foresaw the very real possibility that Biden could lose, that he could lose re-election. I don't think anyone was expecting that the Democratic Party, which is always so cautious and so careful, that they would form this coalition essentially trying to oust their own nominee. What's so ironic about it is that in 2016, a chorus of Republicans called on Trump to step aside when, the tapes came out where he was essentially talking about sexual assault, and when you're famous, you can get away with anything. Trump not only refused to step aside, he went on to win that election, and the party just largely coalesced behind him. And I don't think anyone would have foreseen that it would be in the Democratic Party, where a president who is mostly still popular with Democrats. There's been backlash toward his handling of Gaza, but overall, among Democrats, he still has pretty high favorability ratings. I just don't think that anyone would have foreseen that it would be in the Democratic Party, where you have them push out the nominee who has already been serving as president for an entire term.
And that's The Take. This episode was produced by Alexandra Locke, Sonia Bhagat, Ashish Malhotra, and Sarí el-Khalili, with Khaled, Soltan, Duha, Mosaad, Tamara, Khandaker, Mohammed, Zain, Shafi Khan, Veronique, Eshaya, and me, Malika, Bilal. The Take production team is Amy Walters, Ashish Malhotra, Catherine Nouhan, Chloe K. Lee, Duha, Mosaad, Khaled, Soltan, Manahil, Naveed, Marcos Bartolomé, Noor Wazwaz, Sarí el-Khalili, Sonia Bhagat, Tamara Khandaker, Mohammed Zain Shafi Khan, and Veronique Eshaya. I'm your host, Malika Bilal. Our sound designer is Alex Roldan. Joe Plord makes this episode. Alexandra Locke is The Take's executive producer, and Nay Alvarez is Al Jazeera's head of audio. We'll be back tomorrow.